fully understand that the African American community has suffered from discrimination and that there are many wrongs that must still be made right.
Today, a debate between Dr. Ben Carson, a Trump advisor, and Congressman Gregory Meeks, a top Clinton supporter, on who has better ideas to help minorities. Then, the other woman on the presidential ballot. Dr. Jill Stein, the Green Party's nominee, on her strategy for November. Plus, Clinton faces new scrutiny over her responses to the FBI as her race against Trump begins to tighten. We'll ask our Sunday panel how the new revelations will play with voters. All right now on Fox News Sunday. And hello again from Fox News in Washington. Hermine, the once and apparently future hurricane, has already claimed the lives of 2 people. It's moving slowly up the eastern seaboard, leaving hundreds of thousands of people without electricity. And it's set to do even more damage. Fox News meteorologist Maria Molina is live in Atlantic City, New Jersey, with the latest. Maria.
Hi, Chris. That's right. I'm here in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where the worst of the storm is forecast for late tonight and also into tomorrow. Hermine is still well offshore, but as you can see behind me, the water is already churning. We have concerns for rip currents, dangerous surf, and also beach erosion. And because the storm system is such a slow mover, we will be feeling the impacts for several days, not just here in Atlantic City, but also across areas farther off towards the south, across Maryland, Delaware, and also extending north across portions of New England. Tropical storm warnings and watches have already been issued, and the turn towards the north has not yet happened, but it is forecast to happen later on today, and it will also slow down in forward speed, and that's why we will feel those impacts for several days. The closer it tracks towards the coast, the more we will feel those tropical storm force winds across coastal communities. Another big threat is coastal flooding, especially during high tide across many of these areas. Chris?
Maria, thank you for that. Now to politics. Donald Trump is continuing his effort to reach out to minority voters, visiting a black church in Detroit this weekend and laying out what he calls a new civil rights agenda. In a moment, we'll talk with Dr. Ben Carson, who joined Trump in Detroit, and Congressman Gregory Meeks, a Clinton supporter, about who has the better plan to help minorities. But first, Fox News correspondent Peter Ducey on Trump's stop in Detroit. Peter.
Chris, to get to this inner city church, the first African-American church he'd ever visited, Donald Trump's motorcade had to pass through a rough part of Detroit. And once inside the Great Faith Ministries, the Republican nominee told the congregation he can make Detroit a city the whole world envies again.
We need a civil rights agenda for our time. The right to live in safety and in peace and to have a really, really great job, a good paying job, and one that you love to go to every morning. And that can happen.
Trump's speech that he said was handwritten was very well received by the several hundred people who heard it, and wasn't just optimistic and forward-thinking, it was reflective.
For centuries, the African American church has been the conscience of our country. So true. It's from the pews and pulpits and Christian teachings of black churches all across this land that the civil rights movement lifted up its soul and lifted up the soul of our nation.
Detroit native Dr. Ben Carson took Trump on a tour of his old neighborhood not far from the church. Before the nominee left town, they met with residents, including the woman who now lives in Carson's old house, and the informal visit fit with the pledge Trump made yesterday to listen and to learn to the people he met here. Chris?
Peter Ducey reporting from Detroit. Peter, thanks for that. We want to turn now to Dr. Ben Carson, who is a top Trump advisor and took the nominee to his hometown of Detroit. Dr. Carson, Trump has been on the campaign trail now for 15 months. This was his first trip to an inner city for a public event with African Americans. First, what took him so long? And secondly, what do you think his trip accomplished?
Well, first of all, recognize that traditionally the Republican Party has not made an extensive outreach to certain communities, including the African American community, because they've pretty much written that off as Democrat territory. Donald Trump is changing that narrative and is really starting to talk about this in a very serious way. And I've had many discussions with him about it. He becomes very animated during those discussions, and this is a subject about which he cares deeply. And what is going to be accomplished is something that many in the Democrat Party fear, and that is an alternative to, you know, promises that are not kept. And look at the situation that's going on in our inner cities with the school systems. You look at the incarceration rates that are going on, the broken homes, out of wedlock births, the economic situation. This is not good. And of course it doesn't apply to all blacks, you know, but we have a substantial number of blacks living in our inner cities. And if our inner cities are weak and are not prospering, how can the entire nation prosper? And that is really the goal.
But let me pick up on that, Dr. Carson. Trump laid out what he called a civil rights agenda for our time: education, safe streets, good jobs. I want to talk about the first of those. He calls for school choice, but we looked in all of his speeches during this campaign, we looked on his campaign website, and nowhere does he explain what he means by school choice, how it would work, and how he would pay for it.
Well, it is assumed that people know that school choice means you get a choice of your school. You're not necessarily assigned to a school because of where you live, and if that school happens to be dysfunctional, you just suffer the consequences. That is something that we want to change. We want to give people a choice by a voucher system. And it's very interesting that many people in the political arena are against vouchers and school choice, and yet they send their own children to very prestigious private schools. We're fully recognizing that if you give a person a good education, it doesn't matter what their racial or economic background is, they basically will be able to write their own ticket. This should be a very high priority for us, and it was for those who founded this country. And they talked about the need for an educated and well-informed society, particularly Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson.
But let me pick up on that, because Trump has also called for abolishing the Department of Education, which gives out $1.4 billion a year in what's called Title I funds for schools that are dealing with impoverished students. Here's what Hillary Clinton had to say about Trump and his outreach to African Americans.
It really does take a lot of nerve to ask people he's ignored and mistreated for decades, what do you have to lose? Because the answer is everything.
Dr. Carson, how do you respond to Clinton?
I would simply respond by saying it's really the Democratic Party that has the explaining to do. They've been in charge of our cities for a long time. The city I grew up in, Detroit, was once the most prosperous city in the United States. Some people say in the world. From there, it went to the largest bankruptcy. That was not a coincidence. And we see that in our large cities across the nation under Democratic control. That is a problem. And when that is happening, what Donald Trump is saying, why would you continue down that same pathway? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing, expecting a different result. The result will not be different. Now, he's talking about some real clear things. We've had some in-depth discussions about the $2.1 trillion that are overseas. Repatriating that money with no taxes, with the stipulation that 10% of it has to be used in enterprise zones and to create jobs for people who are unemployed, underemployed, or on welfare. You want to talk about a stimulus? That would be the biggest stimulus since FDR's New Deal, and it wouldn't cost the taxpayers one penny, and it also gets corporate America once again involved in their communities, which they used to be before the government took over and made a mess of it.
Dr. Carson, Trump has a Hispanic advisory council, but after his hardline speech on immigration this week, several members of that council quit. Here's one of them.
It was not a Republican speech. It was not a compassionate speech. I was very disappointed, and I'm not going to be part of that.
Question: Do you
know what I would say?
Do you worry that you're being used as a prop for black voters and that supporting Donald Trump will end up hurting your credibility in the black community?
It's not about me. It's a long time ago. It's not about me. It's about our nation. But I would suggest, Chris, go back and look at the 1995 State of the Union address by Bill Clinton and see what he said. He said, illegal aliens are creating big problems for us, and we're going to put a lot more Border Patrol people on and secure our borders, and we're not going to have people able to work who come in illegally, and we're going to cut off their welfare benefits, and we're going to deport people in record numbers. You know, he says basically the same thing, but when he says it, wow, great standing ovation, this is a great president. And when Trump says it, it's hate speech. What hypocrisy. What incredible hypocrisy.
I've got about a minute left, and I got to ask you one final question, and that is about the fact that the FBI released its files this week into the investigation of Hillary Clinton and her use of a private email system. Your reaction to the facts that were released?
Well, it's very troublesome. You know, she claims not to remember many things. Do you want somebody with inability to remember in the White House? Or do you want somebody who is a prevaricator in the White House? Well, you get a choice. Or do you want to maybe go in a completely different direction altogether? You know, everything is a coincidence. I know it looks bad, but, you know, it's not really that way. And we're really very honest people. And we don't use our office to enrich ourselves. I know it looks that way, and everything points in that direction. But believe us, we're wonderful people. I think at some point people begin to see through that.
Dr. Carson, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you. Thanks for your time on this holiday weekend, sir.
Thank you.
Joining me now, Congressman Gregory Meeks of New York, chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus PAC. Congressman, welcome to Fox News Sunday.
Good to be with you, Chris.
Do you give Donald Trump any credit at all for going into an inner city and meeting with African Americans?
No, because it's not real. Donald Trump has a career here in New York where this is his first time visiting a black church. And so here again, you have what I think is a bait and switch scenario that Donald Trump is trying to put on and to, you know, in the words of Marco Rubio, con the American people, in this instance, con African Americans. It's clearly his record speaks for itself.
You say that he's trying to con them. Do you think that Donald Trump is a racist?
Well, I just say that some of the things, as indicated by the Speaker, by Senator Scott, not by me, some of the things that Donald Trump has said clearly are racist. They've indicated it, that those were remarks that were racist in character. So I can only go by what one says and what one has done. And clearly, if you look at Donald Trump's record from the time that he started out with his father with the lawsuits and to the birther statements and to not acknowledging David Duke immediately to there goes my African American, those are all statements. What do you have to lose? Those are all statements that I would say lend one to believe that he has racist tendencies. At least those are what his beliefs are, if you believe what he says.
But, Congressman, doesn't Trump have a point that things are not getting better in America's inner cities? I want to put up some numbers. 26.2% of blacks now live below the poverty line. 25.5% of food stamp recipients are black, and black home ownership is 41.7%. Congressman, all of those numbers are worse since President Obama took office.
Well, you know, what we are doing now, where we are now, is much better than where we were when President Obama was and, you know, took office in 2008.
But those numbers, those aren't better. Those are worse.
Well, we're coming from the greatest recession since the Great Depression. And a lot of people lost their homes and the wealth in the African American community. And we got to build back. And that's why it's important that we have the kinds of policies that are being talked about by Hillary Clinton that will help build back and reduce income disparity. That's why we also have to make sure that We are raising minimum wage and focused on small businesses, which is important. That's also why we've got to make sure that we're protecting historically black colleges and investing in historically black colleges for education and talking about education that's affordable and free for some, so that the key to tomorrow in America is a better education or trade. And these are all subject matters of which Hillary Clinton has been talking about.
But, Congressman, do you hear anything in the very different Republican ideas about school choice, about enterprise zones, about renegotiating trade deals that have taken jobs out of America's inner cities? Do you hear anything in those Republican ideas that you think maybe that's an interesting alternative?
No. Well, I think that if you go to Washington, for example, there's an idea that Mr. Jim Clyburn from South Carolina put forth called the 10-20-30 plan to help eradicate poverty in America. And I think that it has been embraced. I know it's been embraced by Senator Clinton, but also by Speaker Ryan. There's some kind of dialogue that we can begin to have and talk about, because I think that the issue is we've got to reduce the disparities that we have, because for sure disparities are great within the African American community, but you also got to reduce poverty. And when we talk about issues of poverty, for example, we don't say that those Republicans that represented Appalachia for years are responsible for the poverty that is there. So we've got to have this deep conversation, and I think the conversation could be had on a bipartisan basis, dealing with specific policy as the 10-20-30.
During the Democratic primaries, Bernie Sanders went after Clinton in several cases from the left. For instance, he noted that the welfare reform plan that she supported and her husband signed into law in 1996 resulted in more than the doubling of the number of Americans living in extreme poverty. He noted that the crime bill that she supported and President Clinton signed in 1994 dramatically increased the number of blacks going into prison and the amount of time that they spent there. Isn't that part of the Clinton record?
Well, you know, I think that if you put into perspective what was taking place at that time, and when you look at the crack epidemic and that was going on, much of that took place at that time is taken out of context when we talk today. If you recall, at that time, the income disparity between African Americans and others was shrinking. You talk about unemployment was the lowest that it had been. In fact, so many good things were happening in the African American community that some was calling Bill Clinton at the time the first African American president. So you don't speak of that now, but when you think about small businesses, of which Hillary Clinton is focused on, an investment in urban America and inner cities, creating businesses and opportunities for African American communities, utilizing minority businesses, that was all positive and something that Hillary Clinton talks about today.
Finally, and I got about a minute left for this, I want to ask you to respond to what Dr. Carson said about the release of the FBI files into the emails. More than 24 times during that interview with the FBI, Hillary Clinton said she could not recall, did not remember key events. It turned out she didn't have one BlackBerry, as she had told the press. It turned out she had 15. Your response?
My response is that it's clear. Hillary Clinton has gone through several hearings in Congress. Now you've heard the FBI director say that there's nothing that she did that was criminal or anything of that nature.
Well, he didn't say it was criminal, but he did say it was negligent and extremely careless.
Yeah. You heard that the secretary say that if she had a chance to do it again, she wouldn't have done it. She's been apologetic about that. But there's been nothing. There's been no smoking gun, as the Republicans talked about. You heard my colleague on the Republican side, McCarthy, said all of this was about from the beginning, whether they're talking about Benghazi or other items, was just to try to discredit Hillary, because when you talk policy issues and how we take this country forward, you can't compare. And so you try to divert, so there's smoke and no fire.
Congressman Meeks, thank you. Thanks for coming in today. We look forward to talking to you again, sir.
Thank you.
Up next, we'll bring in our Sunday group to discuss Trump's trip to Detroit, reaching out to black voters. Plus, what would you like to ask the panel about Trump's inner city events? Will his pitch resonate? Just go to Facebook or Twitter at Fox News Sunday, and we may use your question on the air.
for our time, one that ensures the rights to a great education, so important, and the right to live in safety and in peace and to have a really, really great job.
Donald Trump reaching out to black voters in an African-American church in inner-city Detroit yesterday. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Fox News senior political analyst Britt Hume, Neera Tanden, president of the liberal think tank, the Center for American Progress, Ann Giron of the Washington Post, and syndicated columnist George Will. Britt, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you.
What do you think of Trump's visit to Detroit and that black church yesterday? And what do you think of his outline in very broad strokes of an agenda for civil rights?
Well, I think it was probably worth a try. But I sense that he will probably get more credit with white voters for making the effort than he will from voters in the inner city whose resistance to appeals from Republicans going back decades has been remarkably strong. So I doubt he'll make any inroads of any consequence in that particular segment of the electorate. But nonetheless, you had people looking to find a way that they could possibly support him. We'll see this soft-spoken version of Donald Trump making what I think are some, detailed and serious-sounding, at least, proposals, and that might do him some good, but probably not within that community.
Neera, if Trump weren't talking about these issues, you'd criticize him. Are you going to criticize him for talking about these issues?
I think the fact that he's at 0% of support in some swing states of African Americans is heretofore well-deserved of his policies. I actually think the fact that you pointed out that these policies he stated yesterday are not on his website and his history. I mean, I think the reality here is that most African Americans have come to know him from his attacks on the first African American president, his birtherism, but also his history. The New York Times has a long, detailed story last week about Trump Industries and a history of housing discrimination that goes back 30 years. So I think there's a long record here, and 2 months before the election, having never gone to a black church or even engaged in discussions with black audiences, I think people see this as a transparent attempt to make up something where he's far behind. He's far behind McCain's numbers, Romney's numbers with African-American voters, which weren't strong, but he's still far behind them.
George?
You say 2 months before the election. We're 19 days before the voting starts in some states. And Mr. Trump is saying essentially, never mind what I've said so far, I'm going to change. He campaigned for 400 days after announcing his candidacy and then said, I've got some regrets. He didn't say what they were, but he said, I've got some regrets. He goes to the black church, reiterates standard Republican views, school choice and all the rest. But people are supposed to forget he's a birther, or at least he was. He's the one who said he'd sent, 5 years ago, I've sent investigators to Hawaii to investigate the president's birth, and people are going to be amazed by what they found. He hasn't told us, but again, they're supposed to forget that. He goes to Mexico and says, the people I've described as rapists are actually now exemplary Americans. Then he goes to Phoenix, and he chooses to be introduced by Joe Arpaio, the sheriff of Maricopa County, who's the very face of hostility to immigrants. I don't think it'll work. Obviously, the Hispanic vote, like all American votes, isn't quite monolithic. But still, what should worry Republicans most of all is that in 2012, Mitt Romney did even worse among Asian Americans than he did among Hispanics, which indicates that minorities generally do not feel welcome in the Republican Party.
Britt, are you as resistant to his outreach to minority voters as Brother Will here?
Well, there is a contrast, obviously, between the soft-spoken man speaking in that church yesterday and the bombastic Trump of days before when we heard so much of, which suggests to me that the impression that African-American voters and other minority voters as well may have of him, it may be sitting in cement, which is why all the things George cites, I think, are part of the reason why I think he'll have trouble rallying much support, if any, in the community where, as Neera pointed out, he stands in some states at 0.
Yeah, that's bad. All right, let's turn to the issue of Hispanics, because Trump also tried to make an outreach this week to the Hispanic community. A couple of weeks of talking about softening his position on mass deportations. Then, as we see in the middle of the week, he went on Wednesday to Mexico City, met and had a very respectful press conference afterwards with Mexican President Peña Nieto, sounding a diplomatic note. But later that same day in Phoenix, he said this.
Day one, my first hour in office, those people are gone. You can call it deported if you want. The press doesn't like that term. You can call it whatever the hell you want. They're gone.
And Trump was talking there specifically about illegal immigrants who commit further crimes, not just coming across the border illegally, but further crimes once they get in. But despite that specific point, for all of this back and forth over the last 2 weeks about was he going to soften, was he going to harden, did it do him any good with Hispanic voters?
Well, probably not a great deal. I mean, you see the dueling efforts here of Kellyanne Conway and a group of other Trump advisors who are pulling him in opposite directions on what he should be doing to at least give a credible sense of outreach and openness to Hispanic voters. She's a pollster. She's a demographer. She sees the ultimate imperative of his having to have an outreach to Hispanic voters, and for Republicans to have an outreach to Hispanic voters past this election, whatever happens to it. She's doing making some effort to have him make that outreach. I think what you're left with here is you can pick which Trump you like from 5 hours apart, right? They were different people saying different things, and Hispanic voters are going to look at both of those images and certainly more likely see what he said in Phoenix as the real Donald Trump.
But I want to pick up on this with you, George. And let me begin, first of all, with this question, because we asked you for questions for the panel, and we got this on Twitter from Ron, who tweets, voters have their minds made up, especially the African-American voters. So, George, let me ask you, first of all, how do you answer Ron? But also, what about this point that you heard from Ben Carson, that you hear from Donald Trump? Look, you've had decades of Democratic government in America's inner cities. They're the bosses in most of the elected officials in most American inner cities, and things have not gotten better in a lot of places. And as we pointed out in some statistics, they've actually gotten worse.
It's indisputably true what Ben Carson says. The blue model of government, so-called, the alliance of the Democratic Party and the public employees unions, particularly the teachers unions standing athwart school choice, has not served the African community well, African-American community that's in the cities. That said, there's no reason to believe that the standard Republican appeal, school choice, welfare reform, all the rest, that Jack Kemp brought to American politics, he ran as the running mate of Bob Dole, had no effect so far as I can tell. And I don't see it having any effect this time around.
All right, we have to take a break here, but we'll see you panel a little later. Up next, the Green Party's presidential nominee, Jill Stein, on appealing to voters who are unhappy with the choice of Trump or Clinton. Plus, what do you think? Will the third-party candidates be real factors in the November election? Let me know on Facebook or Twitter at Fox News Sunday, and use the hashtag FNS. She's the other woman on the presidential ballot, a doctor and the Green Party's 2012 candidate for president. This year, Dr. Jill Stein is back on the campaign trail once again, the Green Party's presidential nominee. Dr. Stein, welcome to Fox News Sunday.
Good to be with you, Chris.
Let's start with your platform in this campaign. We're going to put it up on the screen. You call for Medicare for all, a guaranteed federal job for anyone who wants one, free college tuition, canceling all student loan debt, cutting military spending by 50%, and ending all wars and all drone attacks. Dr. Stein, how much will that cost, and how are you going to pay for it?
So let me say first, we don't call for ending all wars, but we call for ending these catastrophic regime change wars that have cost us $6 trillion by the time we've paid for the health care of our wounded veterans. That's according to a recent Harvard study. And remember, this is half, more than half, of our discretionary budget. So that's part of how we pay for things. Another way we pay for things, in fact, we call for a Green New Deal, an emergency jobs program to fix the emergency of climate change. And the great thing, Chris, is that this program pays for itself. And I can say this as a medical doctor, it turns out we get so much healthier by eliminating fossil fuel pollution. 200,000 deaths every year, in fact, from fossil fuel pollution. We get so much healthier that the savings in health care alone is enough to pay for the green energy transition.
Now, the Washington Post...
And something like...
Well, let me just pick up. The Washington Post is a pretty liberal newspaper. After interviewing you, this is an editorial that they wrote. The headline, Jill Stein's Fairy Tale Candidacy. And in it, they said this: Jill Stein's policy ideas are poorly formed and wildly impractical. Dr. Stein, that's not good.
Well, I think they called me actually a fairy tale campaign, to which I would answer, in fact, we are living with a couple of nightmare campaigns right now that the American people object to at absolutely unprecedented levels. The American people are saying that politics as usual has been throwing them under the bus, and in fact the two major party candidates have the highest ratings of disapproval and distrust of any candidate anywhere at any time throughout our history. So what I'm saying is what the American people are calling for. 76% of Americans are saying we need to open up the debates. There are actually 4 candidates on the ballot for just about every American. And in America, we not only have a right to vote, we have a right to know who we can vote for. Donald Trump actually has received more than $4 billion in free media, and Hillary Clinton over $2 billion. I've received almost none, and yet still I'm coming up 4 or 5% in the polls with zero media, which tells you there is word of mouth going on out there because a generation of young people is locked into debt. And referring to your question about how do we pay for it, somehow we came up with the money. It turned out to be about $16 trillion to bail out the crooks on Wall Street who crashed the economy. Isn't it time that we bail out an entire generation that's basically been locked in debt, doesn't have the jobs to earn their way out of that college debt? What is more important to us than liberating a generation who can lead the way forward, not only on our economy, but in all of the social issues that we have in front of us? It's always been young people.
Let me pick up on another aspect of your plan, and that's the foreign policy aspect. You call for cutting Pentagon spending in half. You would like to eliminate, you say you would like to eliminate, although you have a caveat there, you may not be able to, all military bases, U.S. military bases around the world. Question, how would you fight ISIS?
Very good point. We would not continue to do the same thing that has failed catastrophically since 9/11, since the trade towers came down. Because what have we done with this $6 trillion, mind you, for just Iraq and Afghanistan alone, which, by the way, costs every American household $50,000 for those 2 wars alone? What have we done with this policy of regime change, this war on terror?
Okay, but how would you fight ISIS?
We've created failed states, mass refugee... I'll tell you in one sec. Failed states, mass refugee migrations, and worse terrorist threats, which is the point. It's not getting better. Every terrorist cause we've been fighting has only been increased and gotten stronger by dropping bombs and shooting them up with bullets. We need a weapons embargo to the Middle East, since we are supplying the majority of weapons which get out to all sides. We call for a weapons embargo, and we call for a freeze on the funding, including our allies. Hillary Clinton identified the Saudis as still the major funder of Sunni jihad terror around
ISIS
the world.
And the people in Iraq and Syria who have also now developed plans? They have struck in the United States, they've struck in France, they've struck in Belgium and a number of other places. How are you going to protect us from them?
So one thing we have to do is not keep doing what we've been doing, which has only made them stronger. Each terrorist threat has gotten worse. We created ISIS out of the chaos of Iraq. So let's not keep doing a proven
I understand what you say we shouldn't do. What should we do?
That's why we're calling, yes. What we should do is deprive them of weapons, deprive them of funding, freeze the bank accounts of our allies that continue to fund these terrorist enterprises, and close the border from Turkey so that the militias cannot cross over into Iraq and into Syria. We created this problem by funding it, by arming it, we and our allies. Remember, this goes back to Afghanistan, where we created this in order to fight the Russians and the Soviet Union by beefing up the Mujahideen and creating this international terrorist enterprise.
I think a lot of people are going to question. We have to move on.
The madrasas.
But let me simply say, I think a lot of people are going to question whether we were responsible for Al-Qaeda and we were responsible for ISIS. But let me move on, because you talked about the fact that you said...
This is why it should be debated, Chris.
Well, that's why we're having you on the show,
because the American people are not happy with the way it's going right now.
Let me ask.
Well, I think
let me ask you, if I may, about Hillary Clinton, because you talk about hers as a nightmare candidacy. You've said some pretty tough things about her. You've said that she has had a horrific career, your words. You say that she's too big to jail. What's wrong with Hillary Clinton?
Well, what I said about Hillary Clinton is that she cannot be the good guy in the white hat while Donald Trump is the bad guy in the black hat. Donald Trump says despicable things, but Hillary Clinton, unfortunately, has a record for doing many terrible things. Donald Trump talks about deporting Muslims. Unfortunately, Hillary Clinton has been bombing Muslims. 1 million people killed in Iraq alone, and we've only created a greater catastrophe there. The Republicans are the party of hate and fear-mongering, but the Democrats are the party of deportation, detention, and night raids for immigrants who, in many cases, have been forced to flee into this country as refugees from NAFTA, which Hillary Clinton and Bill gave the thumbs up to, in fact, signed, and Wall Street deregulation, which led to the disappearance of 9 million jobs here in America. So the things that are terrible right now in our economy are very much go back to the policies of the Clintons as much as the Republicans.
Dr. Stein, we're going to have to leave it there. We thank you very much for coming on, and you can't say that you've had zero media exposure anymore because you've been here. Thanks so much.
And I appreciate it, and I look forward to getting into the debates so the American people can hear the full story.
Thank you. When we come back, the FBI releases files from its investigation and interview of Hillary Clinton. We'll bring back our Sunday group to discuss what she told them and the impact it will have on her campaign.
She should have known not to send classified information. And as I said, that's the definition of negligent. I think she was extremely careless. I think she was negligent.
FBI Director James Comey telling Congress while he didn't see grounds for prosecution, Hillary Clinton mishandled classified material on her private server while she was Secretary of State. And we're back now with the panel. So, Britt, in her FBI interview, by one count, Clinton said 27 times that she did not recall or could not remember key events and details. As for the emails about drone attacks and CIA assets, she said that she relied on her staff, and if they sent her something, she assumed it was not classified. Do you find those explanations or failure to recall persuasive?
Of course not. And I don't think many normal people would. And it simply furthers this impression people have that this is an extraordinarily, exceptionally secretive and even indeed dishonest person now running for the highest office in the land. Under normal circumstances, such things as the mishandling of classified information, negligence in the handling of classified information, would be utterly disqualifying. In this particular year, under the circumstances, given the nature of the opposing candidate, she's ahead. Whether over time this stuff, and there's likely to be more of it, will weigh her down to the point where people just might find it in their hearts to vote for the alternative is the question. Based on the polling we've seen so far, it doesn't look like it will be enough, but it's something to watch out for.
Nero, we should point out you are close to the Clinton campaign. You've been an advisor to her over the years. We all know Hillary Clinton is whip smart. So how do you explain her vagueness on all these events, and even saying she didn't really understand how the classification system worked.
No, she didn't say she didn't understand how the classification system worked. I mean, I think what's good about this is that everyone can read these documents. I've read them.
She said she didn't really understand the difference between various levels of classification. And in the C marking, she said she didn't understand that at all.
She said that she took all the classifications very seriously. So she didn't differentiate in the way she handled because all of them were seriously. That's what she said in the testimony.
Which is why she did it on that private email.
And I think this issue, I think the issue of the emails is she has, I recommend people read this. There's 27 or so emails that she's asked to remember out of 60,000. She couldn't recall each one of those emails. But you see in the process that
wait. That's not quite true. She says at various points, it isn't just emails. She said, no, she's asked, do you remember when you were told how the classification system worked? And she said she didn't remember that specific briefing.
Right. Out of the
That's not an email. That's a briefing.
Let's just be clear. I want to be crystal clear about this. Out of the 27 times Britt mentioned, many of them are emails. So that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. I want to be crystal clear about that. So I think the important thing here is just to step back, that we have had this massive investigation into this effort. There, you see from this why the FBI did not move forward with any other action on this. And I think she's recognized that this was a mistake to set up this server.
Okay.
And she said that multiple times.
I want to pick up on one other.
Whereas I do
want to pick up on one other aspect of this.
I'm sure, but I just need to say that we have not had we've had a full discussion of this, but we just learned this week that Donald Trump was engaged in a pay-to-play with the Attorney General.
Can we stick to this
I'm
subject?
happy to, but I would love.
But I hear. All right, I'm going to just go ahead with my.
There's not a lot of coverage on Fox. I would love to get some coverage for that as well.
Okay. Well, it has gotten covered. But in addition, in March of 2015, in her news conference at the United Nations, here's how Clinton explained using a private email system.
I opted for convenience to use my personal email account, which was allowed by the State Department, because I thought it would be easier to carry just one device for my work and for my personal emails instead of two.
Buntnera, the FBI says she didn't use one email device. She didn't use two email devices. She used 15 BlackBerries. And if I may just finish the question, and the FBI was unable to recover 13 of those 15.
This is a great point. There were always one BlackBerry at a time. She didn't use 15 at a time. I've gone through, I know it's ridiculous. I've gone through my fair number of BlackBerries, but it's not that she had 15 BlackBerries at a time. I think this is an important part of reading through this investigation. You'll see that that's the reality.
All right. George, what do you make of the FBI interview, and what effect do you think it'll have on the campaign?
Well, there are two kinds of scandals that are ruinous for a candidate. One is one that reinforces a negative narrative about the candidate, and the other is it subverts a positive narrative. This amazing email scandal does both. That is, it reinforces the idea that the Clintons are entitled and shady and indifferent to the distinction between law and not law. And it subverts the idea that she's a seasoned, experienced government official who looked at the C marking and said, gee, what could that mean? Could it mean classified? She had no idea, evidently. Clearly, she or people acting on her behalf destroyed materials that were under subpoena from a congressional committee, just as the IRS did with Lois Lerner. So this is a very familiar matter. Now, does this matter? How many people are at this point undecided? I maintain still the belief that most Americans give more due diligence to the selection of a car than a presidential candidate, and I'm not sure that details of this granularity matter.
All right. We're almost out of time, and I want to bring Ann in because on this question of whether or not it matters, the race is clearly tightening. I want to put up some numbers. On August 9th, in the Real Clear Politics average of polls, Clinton was leading Trump by more than 7 points. Now that lead is down to 3. As somebody covering the Clinton campaign, do they think that the revelations, the continued series of revelations about the emails and the relationship with the Clinton Foundation, that it's hurting her?
Clearly, it is hurting her. I mean, the Clinton campaign would like to finally put the entire email episode in the past and move on from it. And every couple of weeks or so, something happens that doesn't allow them to do so. I will say, however, they've always factored in that the race would probably be within 5 points at the end. So if we're at a more or less, if we're at stasis now, they'll take it.
All right. And I will, on your behalf, Nira, say that you file a strong dissent on all of this. Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday. Up next, our Power Player of the Week. Maryland's governor takes us inside his battle against